Chapter 4, Topic 2, ESXi Management. There are a whole series of products that are available to you for managing your VMware infrastructure that come with the product when you first install it. Now obviously we have the physical ESXi host. You can physically walk up to the host, plug a monitor and keyboard in, and be able to do things at that host locally. What that means is there is a way to get to a command prompt. Now it is not enabled by default. That is a security hold if it was, but it's something you can enable, and I'll show you in a little bit where you can enable that. But once it's enabled, you can go in and get to a local command line. Now obviously that means you've got to have physical security wherever your servers or your hosts are. Okay? Now, beyond walking physically in, there are technologies that are available to you as if you had walked into the physical environment. There's a DRAC or ILO, an IPMI card basically, that's available in most hosts if you purchased that add-on or if it came with it. There's also IPKVMs and other technologies if you're in things like Blade Centers or UCSs these days. And once you connect through those, it's as if you've walked into the data center and are physically connected. So you can access the exact same local binary executables that are available on the host as if you walked into the data center. Now obviously there's also the ability to enable the SSH service or daemon. If you enable that, you can use any SSH product to connect, and typically you're going to connect as root. Now this is a remote connection to the host, but what it provides you with is access to the same executables and binaries as you would use if you were physically in the environment. Additionally, you can install on your local desktop something called the vCLI. The vSphere command line interface is nothing more than a series of Perl scripts. Now you'll notice that not only can we manage an ESXi host, but we can also manage our vCenter top-down management server using vCLI. But again, it's installed locally, and you would have to authenticate against one or the other of the two entities. Another command line technology that's available is PowerCLI. PowerCLI is simply a series of PowerShell commandlets you install locally on top of PowerShell, giving it extended capability to either manipulate a host or vCenter. Very simply put, you could, if you wanted to, manage your entire virtual infrastructure completely from the command line using PowerCLI, and there's actually a couple sites dedicated to doing that. You can even execute scripts inside the operating systems of some of your virtual machines running on your hosts using PowerCLI. So it really is very powerful, no pun intended. Now obviously we've all talked about or used in the past the VIC, the vSphere client, the .NET client, the FAT client, whatever you want to call it. It is going away eventually. They can't get rid of it right now because there's no way to use a web interface to get into an individual ESXi host. So until that changes, we're going to be stuck with the FAT client, at least for managing individual ESXi hosts. And currently you can still connect to vCenter using it, but they're pushing us to use the web interface for all future management tasks through vCenter. Now they've had for a long time a downloadable appliance, standalone virtual machine that's running on SUSE Linux. It includes a copy of the vCLI and VMware tools and the software developers kit in Perl. The idea there is you have this virtual machine running, and rather than installing vCLI on several different desktop computers, you just use PuTTY and connect to the VMA and use the vCLI from inside there against either a host or vCenter. And the final interface we have is the web interface. It can only be used to connect to and manage your infrastructure through vCenter. Now we're going to talk about each of these in more detail. Now we're back to that lovely colored screen called the DCUI, or Direct Console User Interface. We've pretty much talked about all the things that are available there, but you may not realize there are a couple other keystrokes you can use. If you've enabled the ability to get to the command line, Alt F1 will get you there. Once you're at the command line and want to come back, Alt F2 will bring you back to the lovely colored screen. Oh, you don't like the color of the screen? Well, you can hit F4 and change it to a high contrast black and white. It's kind of like a reverse negative. Pretty ugly in itself. There's also the ability to do Alt F12 and pull up a text-based screen which is a running real-time access to the VM kernel log files. And of course we've got F2 and F12. Now the vSphere client for ESXi is pretty much on its last legs. Most of us that have been doing this for a long time have gotten very used to using the VIC or the vSphere client because we can connect either directly to a host or to vCenter. Now you need to realize that all new features as of 5.0 and higher are only accessible through the web client, not through the vSphere client. As a result, this will be going away, and if you load the latest version of the vSphere client, it actually has a little disclaimer on the screen saying this is going away. But you still need it to connect to a host or to connect and use Update Manager from vCenter. Neither of those technologies have the ability to use the web client yet. Now, kind of an archaic thing that still exists is something called the Management User Interface, or MUI. Basically, it's a static web page that's built into one of three different entities. Now, the first screen we're looking at here is a standalone, old-fashioned ESX4 host. And you'll notice when you go to the actual name of that host, it pulls up this screen. The first link you see is one to download the VIC. So if you don't have a copy of the VIC locally, you can click on that first hyperlink and actually download it to your local desktop. There's also two other links below that, one of which will allow you to download a demo copy of vCenter if you didn't have it, and the last one takes you back to the pubs.vmware.com site. In the upper right, it mentions something about web client. Well, that's not really the web client, it's the older web interface. And it was very, very limited, and they actually got rid of it and replaced it with something much better. On the middle right, there's a link there for browsing data stores. It gives you a web-based, text-based screen to browse the different data stores that are on your host. And in the bottom right, you've got stuff for developers. Basically, it allows you to download the Software Developers Kit or actually look at some of the objects and their values that are on the host. Now we're looking at the screen you would get if you did the same thing and went to either the IP or the web name of an individual standalone ESXi 5 host. Notice we still have a link for downloading the VIC, we still have a link for downloading vCenter, and we still have a link to go to the pub site. But in the upper right, it's changed. Since you can't web into a host anymore, we have three other options, two of which are to download the vCLI, either the Windows version or the Linux version. The third link is for downloading the VMA, that standalone appliance that includes the vCLI. The other links at the bottom right are exactly as we saw for ESX4. This final screen is one that kind of ticks me off. This is typical of everything in the industry, and why I asked earlier on, what does vSphere represent? Well, vSphere is not any technology, but this is what VMware did on their own screen when you connect directly to a vCenter server. So if you just type in the name or IP of your vCenter server, this is the MUI screen you get. Notice again we have a link for downloading the VIC or the vSphere client. We don't have a link to download vCenter because you're connected to vCenter already, although there is a link to go to the pub site. In the upper right now we do have a link for the new web client. And then the remaining links on the right side are the same as what we saw before. Now, the new vSphere web client was introduced in 5.0. The one that was in 4 was very, very limited and was called Web Access. This is now called the vSphere web client and does give you full control capability over your virtual infrastructure if you're webbing into vCenter. Remember, you can't use this to connect directly to an individual host. It only works with vCenter. Once you web in, the first screen is going to give you a little overview of all the different sections that are available to you. Now, although there are different panes that you can move around, they have to move around within their own side. So, for example, on the right side, the right column has a series of different panes that you could slide up and down and change their order, but you couldn't drag them into the middle and make them part of the middle pane overall. Once you get more comfortable with this interface, you'll find that it actually is very functional. Unfortunately for us that have been using the VIC for a long time, it takes some getting used to. Things are in very different places in some respects. One of the original design features was that you should theoretically be able to get to any object with no more than 3 clicks. So in that respect is a tab called Managed Objects. And when you click on that, things that are related to where you are also available. And that's completely unique to the web interface. Here we have a picture of the web interface while we're connected to the infrastructure. You see on the left side there are actually the 4 views that we would normally see in vCenter, which are host and clusters, VMs and templates, data stores, and networking views. But the power really comes when you look at an individual VM and you're able to do just about anything and everything through the web interface that you were used to doing through the VIC. Now, there is the ability to provide SSH access to a host. It is something that is disabled by default for obvious security reasons, but you can enable it through, in the older version, tech support mode, or what is now called troubleshooting options mode. Once you enable SSH, you have the ability to use any of the major products that are out there, typically things like PuTTY, SecureCRT, WinSCP, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the built-in tools you can use is the Datastore Browser. Basically, any place that you can see one of the data stores, which is the storage that is provided to a host, you can right-click on it and choose Browse Datastore. When you open up the Datastore Browser, what you're looking at typically are directories that hold the files that make up your virtual machines. Now, depending on what you want to do, when you right-mouse click on any one of those folders, you have certain context menu options. And you'll notice some of them include cut, copy, which means you could also paste. So if you were to open 2 separate windows of Datastore Browser between 2 different data stores, you could theoretically move or copy the VM files between them. There's nothing intelligent about this. Be careful. There's even a warning when you choose the move, but there isn't one for copy and cut, okay? Because this is not intelligent. This is not informing either the host or vCenter anything about what's going on. If you really want to do things intelligently, you want to use either storage vMotion or cold migration later on through the vSphere interface when you're connected to vCenter. All right? You can also delete things, be very careful of that, and you can move folders around from one data store to another. Now, there's also the option to search, and a lot of people don't even realize the little search tab is available, and you can pick certain types of entities. Now, there are a couple of unique things within the context menu. It's not visible on this screen, but if you were to go into one of the VM folders and find the file with a VMX extension, remember that's the answer file that we use when we create a VM. If you were to right mouse click on it, you get the additional option at the top of the menu called Add to Inventory. So if you had files for a VM, but it was not listed in the inventory pane in the VIC or the web client, then you could add it by right-clicking on it and saying Add to Inventory, which would kick off a little wizard which would ask you where in the inventory you want to put it. There's one other thing that if you go to a VMDK file, which is actually thin provisioned, it'll give you the option to right-click on it and inflate, making it thick provisioned. We'll talk all about thick and thin later on. If you have no idea what I'm talking about at this point, don't worry about it. There is no deflate option, though. We'll also talk later about how to change the provisioning of any storage you've got. Now, to get to the options for enabling things like local access, called ESXi shell, or coming in remotely through SSH, which is just called SSH now, you need to go to the DCUI, log in after hitting F2, and going to the Troubleshooting Options screen. You'll notice that you have a series of options on the troubleshooting screen. The first one is to enable the ESXi shell. This is simply a toggle, so if you hit Enter, it's going to enable it. If you hit Enter again, it'll disable it. The next option is doing the same thing with SSH. Again, it's a toggle that you can turn on and off. The third option here is a series of values, timeout values. And when you select it, you'll notice there's actually 2 timeout values. One, there's an availability timeout. So if you enable this technology and then you don't actually use it, it's going to just turn itself back off. The second one is the idle timeout. So if you enable it, but you don't use it at all for a series of time, even when some people have used it, it's going to eventually turn itself off too. In other words, it closes the hole you're creating by opening up a window into your management services. It's probably a good idea to set these to something, because if you notice from the screen they're set to 0, and 0 means they're actually disabled, so it'll never turn them off for you. It's very nice to be able to turn these on, forget about them, and let the system turn them back off for you later. The last option on the screen is restarting management agents. We briefly mentioned this before. There are two ways to do this, either here from the GUI interface in the DCUI or from the command line, and this is what I call the sledgehammer approach. The thing I don't like about the one in the GUI, it doesn't show you anything except stopping agents and starting agents, and that's it, whereas the command line gives you all the detail. If you've enabled both ESXi shell and SSH, then you're going to see in the Summary tab while vic'd into a host a yellow bar that pops up with configuration issues. This is a banner warning you that, hey, we've opened these security holes, just as a reminder, until you either manually turn them off or the timeout values turn them off for you. Now, if you were in, say, a test environment and you didn't want these to be displayed, or, for example, in our lab environment where we're going to be using these all week long, we enable them, and then we have you in one of the upcoming labs disable the actual warnings you're seeing on the screen. This is under Advanced Options. Now, this is the first time we've talked about Advanced Options, and we're going to refer to it many times throughout the class. Advanced Options are also available under the Configuration tab. Now, keep an eye out because there's two different sets of Advanced Options, one under Hardware and one under Software. We want the one all the way down at the bottom on the left called Advanced Options under Software. In there are a series of different settings. I compare it to the Windows registry in Windows. Now, the one we're after is called User Vars, and it's set to 0 by default. If you change it to 1, it will disable this warning, so it will no longer appear on the screen. Now, there are a whole series of command line options. The first one is ESXi. This was introduced in 5.0 of vSphere as a brand new command line interface, and it's designed to replace all the older technologies we have, although there are still the older technologies available. If you look a little bit further down the chart, you see ESXCFG config, or ESXCFG dash, and then you would add some command like nix if you wanted information about the nix. Well, that's been replaced with an ESXCLI command, and we're going to talk about those in more detail in a little bit. The vCLI also adds interfaces or Perl scripts that give you the same kind of information that used to be available directly on a host using ESXCFG commands. Those are called VICFG commands. Remember, we've got a whole other interface called PowerCLI that we can use that is also command line based, and VMware introduced something called Local CLI to give them backdoor access and bypass the hostee process as we go. Now, ESXCLI is not a complete namespace yet. It will be eventually. In 5.0, it had a limited set of commands. In 5.1, they added a whole bunch more commands. In 5.5, they added several more commands. So they're growing over time, and it's a namespace, kind of like DNS is a namespace, and we'll investigate that here in just a second. So, you need to realize that there are actually several methods to perform the exact same steps currently in version 5.0, 5.1, or 5.5 of ESX. The primary focus when you're at the command line, whether you come in locally or you come in remotely, is the ESXCLI namespace. You want to get used to using that for everything. Or you could still use some of the older ESXCFG commands if you have, say, scripts that are written to use them, but plan on converting those to ESXCLI over time. And again, the vCLI is available. Now, something we haven't talked about is vimcmd. vimcmd has actually been around a long time and has never been really well documented. It came out in the beginning as a program called vimsh, or vim shell. Now, if you Google vimsh, you're going to find a lot of information out there. I have some links on one of the other slides coming up that will talk about it. And again, you could do things through PowerCLI. So it's a matter of picking one and sticking with it. focus on ESXi as your primary way of doing things at the command line for now. ESXi, as I mentioned, is based on a namespace. In other words, you literally type ESXi at the command line. If you wanted a command list of everything ESXi can do, you would literally type at the command line ESXi, command list, and it would list out absolutely everything in the tree structure. So what you do basically is you start with the command ESXi, and then you move on to some other command you would type at the line, like network, and then you would go down below network and type something else. And you can keep going down this tree structure until you get to something like get, set, list, or whatever the command is that you're trying to do. Now there are also these other commands that are out there, such as vimsh and vimcmd, that allow you to do some of the tasks that you may not yet be able to do through ESXi. The links on the screen here take you to, some posters that are available, but it'll also take you to links at the bottom that better explain vimsh and the commands that you can use with vimsh or vimcmd. vimcmd is available today, still, in ESXi 5.5. And we're going to look at some of those commands when we get to networking from the command line. The vSphere command line interface, or vCLI, is simply a downloadable set of Perl scripts available for free from VMware for download. There's two versions of this. There's one for the Linux world, and there's another version for the Windows world. If you install these on a Windows box, it'll automatically install active Perl for you. If you install it in a Linux box, it's going to assume you have a Perl interpreter or scripting engine already there. A third version of this is inside the VMA, or vSphere Management Assistant, appliance. You don't need to add anything, it's automatically there. The bottom line is you now have a way of doing remote commands against either a host or a vCenter through Perl, and they mimic the commands that were available originally from inside the host, such as those original ESXCFG commands. If you were to look at the command structure that's available on a hard drive of a Windows box on which you've installed the vCLI, and you go to the bin folder and do a directory listing, you would see a series of files that start off with the name ESXCFG-something.pl for Perl. Those are used to mimic the original binary executables on a host. Those were originally for ESX. Down below, you'll see there are some that are called VI-CFG-some command, and they match up with each other. The VI ones were originally used for ESXi. Well, guess what? Today, either of them can be used for either platform. Now, ESX has more or less gone away, so it doesn't really matter. So the idea is that if you're going to use the vCLI, stick to the VI-CFG commands to use. You'll also notice that there's one in there called svmotion.pl. We'll talk about that later. And that came from the original remote command line interface, and that's storage vMotion. There's also an executable file in there called ESXCLI. We'll talk about that too. Now, topics from our advanced vSphere 5 class, which is really designed to be taken after this one, include things like session file or using VI FastPath from within the VMA. There are ways to store session information, so you don't have to continually have the command line connecting to and authenticating against either a host or a vCenter. And again, that's information we provide in the detailed advanced vSphere 5 class, which is designed to be taken as a follow-up to this one. We've mentioned before there's also an SDK, or Software Developers Kit. There's actually 3 of them, but one of them has a bunch of Perl scripts. We don't get into it in too much detail here, but if you're a programmer, you can see which Perl scripts are available here in the table to provide you with extended capabilities. We also mentioned that there is something called the vSphere Management Assistant. It is a standalone appliance. Now, the word appliance has many meanings in the real world, but from VMware speak, an appliance is nothing more than a self-contained VM that has a specific purpose. In this case, it's a free downloadable self-contained VM from VMware. It's running SUSE Linux Enterprise Edition. It already has VMware tools installed. It already has the vCLI installed for Linux. It has the SDK for Perl, and it has VI FastPath, which again is mentioned in the next class after this one. Another, and probably arguably the most powerful command line utility available to you free for download, is PowerCLI. Power CLI for 5.5, Release 2, came out in March of 2014. It provides you with the ability to do absolutely anything in the infrastructure. Now, if you came from the world of VB scripting, it's not all that unfamiliar. It uses the same syntax and logic structure as VBScript does. It's based on PowerShell, which, yes, is a Windows product. So obviously this needs to be installed on a Windows desktop. What it provides you with in 5.5 is well over 400 commandlets. Now, commandlets are just mini versions of a program that you pass parameters to, and it does all kinds of work for you. Now, I'm kind of lazy, and I'll do whatever I can not to work too hard. One of the things I'd be willing to do is learn how to script, even if it takes me 10 hours. If it's going to save me 40 hours in the long run, PowerShell is one of those that you're going to want to learn. Just like you wanted to learn VBScript, if you hadn't, it's time to learn PowerShell, and therefore Power CLI for VMware. Power GUI is a free downloadable program from what used to be Quest, which is now Dell Software. It has many different capabilities. The first one is that you can add to it something called Power Packs. Power Packs allow you to do GUI-based management of your infrastructure for free without having to do any command line or Power CLI or PowerShell scripting. The cool thing is underneath it is PowerShell and Power CLI. It'll actually let you see the code that it's doing to do the work for you if you want, and you can capture and use that later. Now, there are different ways to add things to this system, but they've also recently come out with a mobile version of it. The mobile interface gives you all kinds of information, and also, like the standard GUI interface, the ability to manipulate and manage objects throughout your infrastructure. And finally, it also includes a Power CLI, PowerShell editor, which colorizes certain aspects of the script to give you quicker reference material.